thankful to have Jen. Oh, okay. We are very thankful to have Jen Meixner joining our booth community as we take time to listen and learn during Indigenous Perspectives Week. Jen comes today with incredible insight and wisdom. Jen Meixner uses the pronouns she/her. She is a registered social worker and alumni of Booth. Jen has a master's in Indigenous governance and has returned to Booth in the capacity as a faculty member in the social work program. Jen has worked with the contemporary criminal justice system for 10 years. She examines systemic injustices that are not working with Indigenous people. Currently, she is working with First Nations in the area of self-governance and Indigenous rights. Also, she has a private practice where she does consulting, capacity and program development with Indigenous-led community-based initiatives and programs. Okay, so before Jen shares and tells us about her teachings, we wanted to offer a gift of tobacco and a book. We acknowledge the sacred gift of her wisdom, and while we aren't able to be in person, we want to present you this gift. We virtually wanted to thank you for your willingness to share your knowledge and come here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Miigwech Belinda. That was very well done. Thank you. I appreciate the offering of tobacco, and that's so important, right? When we ask people to come and share, and it just it's a sentiment of starting and going in a good way. So I really appreciate that. Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me today. I am going to talk about my work and what I've come to know in the criminal justice world, And I have to say, it's been a little while since I've presented on this, but I am so excited because it is probably one of my most favorite things to talk about. So for that reason, if there are questions along the way, and only because we only have 50 minutes, please put them in the chat and we will try to get to them at the end. Because if you ask me a question, we'll go off. We will go way off track. So, because I get real passionate about it. So I will do my best to stay on track and answer your questions at the end, okay? Also, thank you for doing that land acknowledgement. I am also presenting today from Treaty 1. My home office is here in Treaty 1, very close to the Stone Fort, where Treaty 1 was signed just over 150 years ago. So I'm very lucky to live so close to such an important and sacred place. And so thank you for joining me from wherever you are for this conversation on decolonizing criminal justice and roles of Indigenous innovation in Manitoba. So what I'm going to talk about today is a few things kind of mixed together. I'm going to be talking about some research that I've done on decolonizing criminal justice and looking specifically at Indigenous innovations across the province or in the province for achieving positive criminal justice outcomes. So this was some research that I did a few years ago, and equally as important as the lessons learned is the process in doing it. So this conversation is also going to be about a process of conducting Indigenous research and transformative research. And then you'll see how my personal life also gets shaped by this work over the years. Because when you do Indigenous research, you as an Indigenous researcher, especially, there's no way to separate yourself from the work that's being done. And I learned that in practice as I went along. I didn't know how this was going to shape my life, but it's been quite an honorable experience. Okay, so yes, just a bit of an introduction. transformative research, Indigenous research. So I'll be talking about that process as well as the personal journey, and then some lessons about the pathways forward. And then I'm also going to talk about some of the work that I'm doing now in Treaty 2 with respect to self-determination and self-governance in the area of justice. Okay, so my introduction. So my position statement, who am I? Thank you for the introduction. My name is Jen. I am Métis and I'm a member of the Manitoba Red River Métis Nation. I have ancestral ties to settlement, Métis settlement in St. Andrews, which is in Treaty 1 territory, very close to where I live, and also to Fairford, Manitoba in Treaty 2 territory. So literature and oral history tells us that for Indigenous people, research is about being an active participant in what we're learning. And in this process, we can affect reconciliation within ourselves, our families, our communities, and with non-Indigenous peoples and systems. And this is very much the experience that I had in doing this research and the way that it shaped my life since then. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that looked like for me. So I worked in the criminal justice system for more than 10 years. I had a number of roles there. I was a community corrections worker, probation officer. I was an IRCS coordinator, which is the intensive rehabilitative custody sentence. And then I was the provincial YCJA court report writer. So I loved the roles and responsibilities that I had. But as the years went on, I began to critically analyze my role within that system and really began to contemplate how and if I was contributing to the change that I wanted to be able to do. So I started working on this research related to decolonizing criminal justice systems while I was actually working in the system. I eventually ended up leaving the system to pursue working with the Manitoba Advocate for Children and Youth. I worked at the office there for a couple of years, and now I'm answering the call to the community, and I'm doing more community-based work. So the relationship with the wisdom that was shared with me through the process of doing this research really shaped my life, and it kind of changed the direction of my path and led me outside of that system that I had worked in for already at that point many years. So the background and statement of the problem. So why are we talking about decolonizing criminal justice systems and outcomes? So there's an overrepresentation of Indigenous people in the criminal justice system. Corrections Canada, Stats Canada, various commissions and inquiries such as the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry, the Royal Commission of Aboriginal Peoples, the TRC, the MMIW National Inquiry, and many, many more, identify disproportionate rates of Indigenous people represented in all areas of the system, as well as the impacts of colonialism and several recommendations for correcting the problem. So what that means is that Indigenous people across Canada are represented as victims and as people who are perpetrating harm at a greater rate, and also making up a greater proportion of people serving various types of sentences, whether they be community-based or custody-based. And also there's disproportionate rates in the types of offenses in terms of sentencing. So where you have an Indigenous and a non-Indigenous person and the offense is the same, the sentence is different, being more onerous for Indigenous people. So that's what we're talking about in terms of disproportionate rates at all levels of the system. So as a frontline worker in that system, I often felt like my tires were spinning and I wasn't really making progress yet. At the same time, interestingly, and I think because of social media, I began seeing more community-based initiatives doing really important and fascinating work. And so some of those at that time were the Bear Clan, Aboriginal Youth Opportunities, which is AO, Meet Me at the Bell Tower was notable at that time. Mama Bear Clan, and then some other leaders like Mitch Bourbonaire and There was Southern Chiefs organization and a few other places that were doing some really innovative, from my view as someone who worked in the system, innovative work and making change. So where there are gaps in recommendations and implementation and change seems to exist, there's value in hearing and acknowledging those local experiences and wisdom to explore why those gaps exist, as well as the perspectives for addressing the problem. So what I mean by that is all of those commissions and inquiries and things that I've mentioned earlier, they articulate the problem very clearly. They connect the issue to colonialism. They not only highlight the problem, but they also talk about ways forward. Aboriginal Justice Inquiry had over 150 recommendations. RCAP outlined a 20-year plan and had hundreds of recommendations. The TRC had over 20 calls to action specific for justice, and so on. So there's no lack of describing the problem. There's no lack of ideas for how to move forward, but yet we don't see change. So I wanted to explore why that is, but I wanted to explore it from an Indigenous view. I wanted to hear local Indigenous people talking about the issue, describing it, and talking about the gaps, and then also talking about the work that they do, that innovative work. So I'm going to come back to the purpose and objectives in a minute, but the significance of the research, the significance of doing this type of work is that it fills gaps in literature by offering a decolonizing lens of our local narrative as it relates to criminal justice issues. This contribution honors the experience and wisdom of local Indigenous peoples by bringing it to the forefront. Second, the project contributes to a scholarly understanding of local Indigenous innovation in action. This information can be used to strengthen and recreate systems and models of community-led action and social and systemic transformation. Third, the research process itself, Indigenous and transformative in nature, was a contribution in an era of reconciliation. Reconciliation for myself as an Indigenous researcher, for the community, that the ties to the community were strengthened through this research process, and now also in my ability to give back and to share this information whenever I get the opportunity to do that. So the research in itself was a vehicle for change. Okay, so the purpose and objectives of the study, but also of just decolonizing criminal justice systems. Why do we do this? Okay, so literature tells us that since the TRC in 2015, there's an increasing government and institutional interest in reconciliation. That's why we hear that term a lot. This is an opportunity for researchers to confront the dominance of colonial institutions while we have them. And on the other hand, there's also important work to be done to strengthen relationships with Indigenous knowledge outside of those colonial systems. So what that means is that there's an opportunity to work with the system in an era of reconciliation and figuring out what that is. That's a very important role. That's why we need people in that system that has a good understanding of this type of work. And then there's also room to grow outside of that system. The MMIW National Inquiry urges for a decolonized approach to addressing justice issues in Canada. The National Inquiry says that the only way forward, the only way to address and make change to this relationship between Canada and Indigenous peoples, specifically around justice, is around decolonizing, or a decolonized approach. So the study looked at 3 different questions. So number 1 was to understand the barriers of the current system, and from a local Indigenous perspective. Number 2 was to document and local Indigenous innovations. So this is where I looked at those community-based organizations and initiatives and leaders, and I wanted to know, like, what makes you different than the contemporary system? what is working, what can we learn, how can we share this information to, and that's number 3, how do we share this information to strengthen both the system and the work that's happening outside of the system? Because the reality is that Indigenous people, for many of us, we lack faith in the system that has failed us for a very long time. And so lots of the work of Indigenous activists and leaders and community members happens outside of the system. So it's twofold. There's 2 areas and many areas, but those are 2 that we can do this work. So the research design, I don't want to get too much into this. If you're interested, you can connect with me after. But what I wanted to just highlight here was that the role of the researcher. So for myself, they're in the center, transformation. So wanting to learn how to make change from Indigenous perspective. So really amplifying that expertise and that lived experience. And then a decolonized approach is what is being recommended to us, which is why I wanted to take a decolonizing approach to this research, which meant that relationships and making connections was at the forefront, and also challenging the status quo way of thinking about criminal justice and research in general. So what did I do? I did some semi-structured interviews with various leaders locally. I did 2 different sharing circles that were co-facilitated with an elder. So firstly, I did a sharing circle of Indigenous people who were currently or who had been at some point involved in the contemporary criminal justice system. And I was really overwhelmed by the number of people that didn't know me that showed up and to participate, because they had something important to share, and they were so appreciative of the opportunity to share their experience. Because when we look at literature, I mean, the voices that are often missing are in this context anyways, are the people living it, the people who are behind the bars, the people that are in those institutions, that are in those systems. We don't often look at our community members as the experts on this type of work, but they very much are. And so that was really, really healing for all of us in having that sharing circle. The other sharing circle I did was with former employees of the criminal justice system, because as a former employee myself, I know that when you work in the system, you can't publicly speak out about a lot of things, which was one of the things that kind of curved my path and led me out of there, was because there was a real lack of willingness to be reflective on the system's part on what was happening. And I can talk about more of that after. And then, of course, a literature review, and then community gatherings as a research methodology. So what happened after doing sort of this preliminary research and analysis, I held a community gathering. So the funding that I got to do this research, 100% of it was put back into these Indigenous community-based initiatives and organizations. I hosted an event at the Indian and Métis Friendship Center right before it closed, and made donations to everybody that came, invited all the speakers, all the guests, and other people that were unable to participate. And it was a conversation. It was a community-based conversation, and we had more than 50 people come to talk about decolonizing criminal justice. And then Meet Me at the Bell Tower was also operating at that time. And so this middle picture here with Michael Champagne, and again, we're talking about decolonizing criminal justice, and then went on to have community conversations. So that was very much part of the process. So some of the findings from the work that was done during that period of time, from an Indigenous view, local Indigenous view, what are the challenges? So here's some quotes, okay? So number one, concepts of justice. The criminal justice system has some premises around justice, but if you really dig into that, the reality is that it's impacted by class, race, and gender. And there's a real gap between the myth of justice in a Western view and what really happens. So this was a theme that came up time and time again, that myth of justice, that the contemporary criminal justice system, is really lacking actionable justice from an Indigenous view. Systemic colonial design. So the original clash, we're talking about the fundamental clash in worldviews between Indigenous and Western society. So here's a quote, contemporary man-made laws are not inherent to Indigenous worldview, yet Indigenous people are held accountable to understand and follow laws that they have had no involvement in forming or implementing. And if you really look at, some of the work and activism around, or political organizing, I should say, around self-governance, this is what Indigenous leaders are wanting. They are wanting to be part of the process in forming and implementing. They want to be included in that process as opposed to a product of a process that didn't include them. And then ineffective interventions. So a quote, it is focused on the individual who is carrying all the weight of oppression and that they are the problem. So that means that, the people in society, the most marginalized, or we'll say powerless people in society, tend to be Indigenous people that are involved in the criminal justice system in this context. For example, the people with the most power and the most resources to affect change at a systemic level is the system itself. Yet we look at people in the criminal justice system as them being the problem, as opposed to being reflexive as a system. And I'll give an example of that. Around the time of the study, I think in 2020, it was January 2020, Dr. Ivan Zinger, who is the Correctional Services Canada investigator, so they provide oversight to the Canadian corrections, he made a statement in that January, and he said that the increasingly growing problem that of Indigenous people being disproportionately represented across the system is a result of indigenizing that system, as opposed to really making meaningful systemic change. So what that means is that at a fundamental level, the system is the same. You can add in some elders, you can throw in some, paint your walls different, you can put up a sweat lodge in the institution, and that might be meaningful for some people. It might help people get onto a healing path, sure. But at a fundamental level, it doesn't change the system. It's just the tinkering of laws. And so it was actually said to be part of the cause of the problem. And he says, until Corrections Canada is reflexive on their role in perpetuating the problem, that there will be no change. Secondly, to ineffective interventions, a quote here, really early reintegration is for low risk offenders. And who are the low risk people? Non-Indigenous people. So for example, even in our risk assessment tools that we use, they tend to criminalize Indigenous people, which means they're not eligible for some of these other things, such as early reintegration or various programs and things like that. So for instance, there's a report that the Manitoba Advocates Office did on young people in the criminal justice system out at Agassiz Youth Center, and the misuse of solitary confinement. So problematic youth in custody would be sent to the max security unit, which is isolation. So they're there in isolation, and while they're there, and they're put there very often due to mental health breakdown of some sort, they're put into confinement for extended periods of time, and they were losing access to their resources. They would be skipping, they wouldn't be allowed to have visits. You couldn't have your therapist come, like all of these things, isolating and keeping people away from the resources that they actually needed in the time. So again, that the policy needed to be changed there. And I'm happy to report that the policy has started to change. And since the Advocate's Office did that report, Youth Justice now has to report to the Advocate's Office anytime that there's solitary confinement for more than 24 hours, and anytime that they are using pepper spray, because Manitoba was incarcerating 4 times more youth than any other province in the country, and using pepper spray in solitary confinement at a much higher rate per capita than any other province. So we are starting to see positive changes on that front. And now, so that's the description of the problems. And now we know the problem. It was very nice to learn that and hear it from people's own voice. But why does the problem persist despite knowing this for decades? Like, the law reform journals were talking about the problem since the 50s and 60s, right? And we just listed a whole bunch of other reports, commissions, and inquiries and recommendations that exist. So power and control was the theme that came out from a former staff, a quote: "You can't really say anything. You can't ask for help because the channels of administration are there to maintain the best interest of the government." So even the staff in the system can feel oppressed at some time. A second quote: "There's a lack of support and a lack of them being able to let go of the power and being able to have justice devolution. They don't even want to hear the words justice devolution." So for example, the work that I do now in Treaty 2, negotiating self-governance in the area of justice. So we meet regularly with Canada, and we're working on an implementation for jurisdiction agreement. And even though they say, okay, you can have self-government in the area of justice, they give you the inherent rights policy that's written by Canada that says you can have self-government as long as it fits in this in our inherent inherent rights policy, which does not align with Indigenous views of self-governance and self-determination. So there's a lot of barriers around power and control. And then lastly, non-Indigenous organizations add in a few little Indigenous things and then make it look like it's all about Indigenous people. It's false. To me, it's a public relations exercise, but what's underneath is that it's all about maintaining power and control. And so this is one of the barriers that Indigenous community-based organizations experience around securing funding. Well, first of all, there's very limited funds out there, and then you have to compete all for the same small pots of money. Non-Indigenous community-based and nonprofit organizations are funded greater than Indigenous nonprofit and community-based organizations. So there's even, that discrimination in the funding of these innovations. And then lastly, this theme that I really think was very impactful for me was termed by Leonard Monkman, who was somebody that was involved in this research process, the economics of Indigenous misery. So this means that it's the acknowledgement that the criminal justice system is an industry. There are people who benefit from the system, namely the people that work in it. And I definitely have been one of those people that worked in that system. And I can tell you the sense of security and having a pension and a union and benefits and all those things is a real challenge to get past in exploring anything outside of that system, right? So that's from an employee point of view. But now our community people, they say, this is what I tell the young men I work with: don't feed the system. The judge, your lawyer, the Crown, the court reporter, the sheriff, the correctional officer, they're all living because you guys are having trouble. And I thought that was really profound. So Indigenous innovation. So Indigenous Innovation, here is a quote from Michael Champagne on Indigenous innovation in a justice context. He says, the funny thing about Indigenous innovation is that it's awfully old. To me, Indigenous innovation is a revival of traditional teachings and implementation in a modern context of traditional teachings. As the definition of innovation implies something new, I would argue that majority of the quote unquote innovative practice we see happening in 2008 related to the justice system, especially the justice system being led by Indigenous people, is simply a revival of traditional teachings as opposed to anything that's new at all. And I love that quote because, well, it kind of took the wind out of my sails a little bit, because I thought like, oh, I'm on something new. And everybody I talked to, not just Michael, told me actually it's nothing new. It's all old. It's just new to people that are have that colonized mind still, right? And this, I've reflected on this so many times in the work that I do with Treaty 2, because as you're going to see, Treaty 2's whole peacemaking framework is based on the Anishinaabe clan teachings. It is absolutely based on traditional teachings, on culture, on identity, on Anishinaabe on the language. So a definition that came out of this study is that Indigenous innovation in the context of justice, an effort, program, initiative, or system created by local Indigenous people from an Indigenous lens, rooted in traditional Indigenous knowledge, worldviews, and ways of doing, to address the needs as identified by the community. And that's an important piece, as identified by the community. Because when you go to Manitoba Justice or Corrections Canada, and you say, like, what's the goal of the justice system? Yes, to protect the community, but also to reduce recidivism, right? And things of that nature. If you go to the community and say, what would be the goal of your justice initiative? Nobody is saying, it's to reduce recidivism. Because actually there's success in these initiatives and in the community, even when people are still wrapped up in the Western contemporary system, because there's an understanding, there's a shared lived understanding at the community level that being part of that system is not necessarily an individual failure. It's a result of a very complex multitude of systemic failures, right? So when we look at, well, what's the goal? What's the objective? How do you know what success is? Defining success is very different from an Indigenous view compared to what a Western view on justice would look like. At the end of the day, though, we all want the same thing. We all want a safe place to live, and we all want an opportunity to thrive in our environments. So some unique features of those innovations that I had the privilege of connecting with. So the nature and description. So where did it come from? We need to start healing our communities, and it has to come from within the communities. It can't be coming from the province or from the government coming in to say, hey, we're here to fix you now, because they're the ones who did the damage. Another quote, you cannot change someone's vision, but you can create your own. We're not providing services here, we're building nations. Again, that was so profound. And interestingly, this was back in 2018, and I've gone back to work at this organization where this quote comes from, because I was so inspired by this. We're not here providing services to people. We do something so much bigger than that. We build nations, we build leaders, we do mentorship. Growing communities, right? It's much bigger than just that individual surface level change someone's behavior. It's so much bigger than that. And then some of the other unique things, the management and practical implementation. So the governance looks different. Often from a Western view, that very hierarchy type governance framework, you'll see in Treaty 2, everything is circular. At other community-based organizations, there's different titles and things like that, but everything is based on community and the collective and the use of councils. Decisions are not made without the approval of various councils. Like that process is very important. And ceremony as part of the governance process is also very important. So agreements requiring pipe ceremonies, the implementations of new laws requiring pipe ceremony, requiring sweat ceremonies or naming ceremonies to name the initiative or name the organization, though the ceremony is part of the governance structure. Characteristics of those innovative champions, I called them, the leaders in the community, the Mitch Bourbonaires of the world. What are those unique characteristics? Well, and it's interesting because I was able to find that because I asked every single person I talked to, who are the people, who are your role models? Who do you look up to? And the most fascinating thing about that was that everybody that I had talked to was talking about each other, and yet they didn't know that each other was in the study. So it was amazing to see that unfold and just to see how connected that community really is. And here I was as an outsider at this time, very colonized mind, working in the Western criminal justice system. I have no idea that this real tight-knit, strong community exists. We don't know about it. So, and some of those unique features is that degrees does not make you a leader. You don't need a degree to be a leader. You need to have respect of your community. You need to know your identity. You need to, know ceremony or have spirituality, whatever that looks like. Those are the types of qualities that people, held in high regard. Because in the Western system, we see people get promoted and lots of us are scratching our head wondering, like, how did that happen? And then, things like that. So that was one of the big differences I saw. Next, criteria for effective innovation. So I talked about that a little bit already. So defining success, that was really different. People talked about success is being at Sundance and then having somebody that you helped come to Sundance and commit for 4 years to participate in Sundance every year. That's success. It doesn't matter if they could still be on probation for that whole time. But that's success because that person is reclaiming their identity and learning their culture, and those other changes will come. So that was very impactful. And then lastly, some of the barriers and challenges. Well, of course, funding, that's always a big one, but not that it was a lack of funding per se. I mean, that's part of it, but it was more so when you do get funding, there's always strings attached and there's reporting requirements. And now there's outcome-based reporting and all these other things that are actually challenging to navigate. And in fact, there's some organizations and initiatives such as the MMIW Coalition that purposely avoids all funding. They fundraise, they meet in someone's house, and they plan massive events, but it's very small scale and it's done intentionally. They have no intention of upscaling because they want to stay in a manageable capacity and because they do not want to navigate the red tape or that bureaucracy of funding. So lessons from, what happened there? Okay, lessons from Indigenous innovation. So I'm going to read to you bottom left-hand corner here, the butterfly teaching shared by an elder in the study. She said, they say when you're in formation, because I think we have been in formation in a lot of ways, that chrysalis has to struggle to get out, to be truly fully revealed. If you interfere with the development of that butterfly in the stages to get out, then you damage it. Then it doesn't have the strength it needs to fly. So maybe there's a grand design. And the question I had asked her was, what can we learn? What's some notable learning from this process of getting your organization up off the ground, or this process that you've been doing for the last 20 years to continue doing the work you do? And she talked a lot about the barriers and challenges, and then shared this teaching with me about the butterfly and how that struggle is actually part of that process. And that's that inherent resilience for Indigenous people, right? So above that, you see the chrysalis and you see the butterfly coming out there. That's the lesson that Indigenous folks wanted to share with the system. No more indigenizing, you don't need to do that. I mean, you do if you want, but what we actually want is for you to honor and implement the decades of existing recommendations. Stop asking the same questions over the time. Stop asking Indigenous people to share their trauma to share their expertise. It's re-traumatizing to have to retell the story every time and then not to see meaningful change after. So first, do your research, do your individual research before coming to Indigenous people to ask. And then in the butterfly, in the center, for people that want to make this community-based change at an Indigenous, for Indigenous folks at a community-based level, which is decolonized approach to justice, is to first and foremost, at the center of all things, to reclaim tradition, land, and identity as Indigenous people. So we as Indigenous people need to reclaim our identity and claim to the land. We need to learn our stories and our teachings so that we can create our visions and move forward in a good way in line with those teachings. Top right-hand side, so partnerships and collaborations. So like I said, there's a whole network of community-based initiatives out there. Connect, collaborate wherever possible, share your resources. Second, celebrate and acknowledge the work that's being done. There's not enough people that know all the work that's happening at a community level. We need to celebrate and acknowledge each other as much as possible. To be persistent, to anticipate this teaching of the butterfly. Self-determination, so we need to be able to identify the needs of our community. We need to have a good understanding of our community. We can't do that without going to the center of the paw here, where we have to reclaim our identity. We have to learn the teachings. That's where we learn our needs and reaffirm our commitment to the community. We need to be inclusive of allies, of other Indigenous initiatives, and then of course to have the skills in the critical resource mobilization. So you need to have that, we call it systems literacy, for example. We need to know the language of the government and those kinds of things, because we have to be able to engage and have partnership. On the bottom left, to show up. Show up. If you want to know whether you're Indigenous or not, if you want to know what you can do to support justice work, decolonized justice work, it's to show up. That means go to Walk Bear Clan, walk with Mama Bear Clan, Community 204, Initiative. There's so many community-based organizations out there. Go find them, participate, show up, go to the events, learn who the leaders are, make relationships. That is how you can start that change within yourself, because that's part of reconciliation. It happens firstly in you, and then your community, and then greater and greater and greater from there. Right? And now for non-Indigenous people, to respect Indigenous people's right to self-determination. That means don't come in with your own ideas and your own vision and way forward. You're there to listen, to follow, to repeat, and to empower, and to utilize your circle of influence to mobilize change. I love this circle of influence. We all have it. We all have it. We all have it at our dining room table, with our families, with our friends. Have the hard conversations. If you're a parent or an auntie or an uncle, like from Indigenous view, we have this whole kinship is so important. And lots of cultures have this, right? That's your circle of influence. Begin the conversation. Okay, so decolonizing criminal justice as we know it means to acknowledge that the answers are in the community. So for example, Treaty 2, I said I would share a little bit about the work that we're doing. So here is our system. So Treaty 2, peacemaking, our governance model. So Treaty 2, peacemaking means peace, balance, harmony, and order being maintained in our local nations in and throughout the Treaty 2 peace territory. The peacemaking system includes territorial and local nation circles, peacekeepers, well-being lodges, and restorative and healing ways of life. So you'll see that we are governed by our Grand Council, which is this outer circle. And then, and this is representation from each of the signatory Treaty 2 nations. So you'll see these logos here are those signatory nations in Treaty 2. Now, peacemaking in particular, because the First Nations in Treaty 2 government has CFS, has, and I'm using Western terminology, CFS, health, education. So there's all of those other things, not just justice. Now, when it comes to justice in particular, this is our peacemaking circle. We are governed again one more time by a governing council, which again has representation from each of the nations. So actually all of the chiefs of all of these local nations sit on the Grand Council, and either the chief or someone else appointed sits on our governing council. And absolutely everything that we do in peacemaking goes to the governing council. And then our laws have to be passed through governing council and then the Grand Council. So a closer look at the peacemaking circle. So you'll see over here on the right-hand side in the yellow section, we start with the bijou circle. This is the link circle. This is our education, what we would call crime prevention, right? This is our education awareness. This also includes supporting people who have been harmed. Then we have our deer circle, which is restorative peacemaking. This means you can have restorative justice without becoming involved in the criminal justice system. We want you to come in and heal before it gets to that point. So this could look like, you know, interpersonal conflict or family conflicts or whatever that might be. You don't have to wait until there's harm committed against someone in a like legal way. We do restorative peacemaking in the nations before that. Down here, we have the Eagle Circle. This is where we have knowledge keepers, land-based education, our programming. So this would be equivalent to, let's say, how Manitoba Justice, for example, has domestic violence program, thinking awareness or thinking for change awareness, or addictions counseling. They have programs that have been developed by the justice system, right? But in order to access those interventions, you have to be part of the justice system. We don't want people to wait till they're criminally involved to get access to those resources. So we have this Eagle Circle. Then we have the Turtle Circle. This is the Mikinak Circle. This is our law center. This is where all of our laws are registered and those kinds of things. Then we have the Makwa Circle. This is the Bear Circle. So this is where peacekeeping is, which would be like policing. So we're negotiating to have a territorial policing system. Where this would be like probation services would be here, search and rescue. That would be the Makwa Circle. And then the Loon and Crane Circle is our court. It's our judicial system. So we have, family law, criminal law. And then when there's appeals of decisions that happen in the Loon Circle, for example, it goes to the Crane Circle, which is our grandmothers council sits here. And the grandmothers of the nations determine whether the decision stands or not. So you see how the power is reinvested back into the nations across the Treaty 2 territory. So where we're at in terms of negotiating this right now is, like I said, we're developing or drafting our implementation and jurisdictional plan. It's very, we're going to be doing a phased-in approach where we'll be doing, the first few circles at a time. These will be in each of the 12 nations. And then on this half of the circle, this will be more of a territorial approach. And these will require like tripartite agreements where we need to bring in the province as well as Canada, but Canada is able to negotiate jurisdiction for these areas. And now pathways forward. So investing in decolonizing criminal justice system builds a better future for all our relations, all of us in Canada. And this is a picture of my boys, and we're on the land in Treaty 1, and they're, learning important lessons, important teachings that will hopefully guide them forward. And this is what we want for all people. So Marcy, Megwich, thank you. That's my presentation. I don't know what time we have. 5 minutes if we have questions. Okay, the chat, Alex. Yes, how, okay, so I actually have an example to share on that. on your question on the abolishing the police and those things. And yes, I very much think that that is the goal for a lot of people, but it's a process. It's not something that can happen all of a sudden, because I think it's more of a matter of reinvesting into other areas. The issue isn't that the police system exists, it's that the resources being utilized there are disproportionate. And we would rather have libraries and community centers not be closed in the highest crime communities, just to increase police presence there. But that is what happens. Those are the priorities of the city's budget, right? So it's about managing the vision for those resources. The other thing is, I was at a conference with Ovid Mercredi, and Ovid is a knowledge keeper, elder, activist, and he came and it was on decolonizing justice. And I went there, it was very fancy, it was at the Fairmont, it was all week long, and there was all kinds of fancy people there, all from all over Canada. And everybody, like 95% of the people there were non-Indigenous, but we were talking about decolonizing justice. So that was kind of off-putting. The Indigenous people that were there, they did bring in elders to say the opening prayer and things like that, but they weren't part of the conversation, and they certainly didn't lead the conversation. So that was just an observation that I made. But they had Ovid come and talk at the very end, and he stood up there and he goes, I know, I think I might upset a few people here because I know you want me to talk about decolonizing the criminal justice system, but I have to say it's not possible. We can't decolonize the criminal justice system, because decolonizing the criminal justice system means actively dismantling colonial systems. The criminal justice system is a colonial system. He said the way forward is not decolonizing the current criminal justice system. It's about building our nations outside of the justice system. It's about our self-government. It's about our self-determination. And that was like, whoo, I wish that would have happened on day one, because I probably would have skipped more sessions. But it was, again, very profound, because it was so aligned with all the things that people in the community were also telling me. And now, I mean, this has been a process of 5 years now doing this work. I'm reflecting back so much because those lessons are just so apparent. So yes, I think it is very much the goal for lots of people, the goal of self-government, self-determination, and building those institutions and systems to meet the needs of their own people and their own nations.
Okay, we are getting close to the top of the hour. I don't want to cut anybody off. Kenneth, there's one more. Can you see the chat there, Jen?
I'm interested in knowing some of the risk factors associated with Indigenous involvement in the justice system. I think the biggest one is colonialism, just the impacts of colonialism, the intergenerational impacts of that. There's very clear connections to residential schools and criminal involvement and various types of offending. So, I mean, that's very apparent. It's been well documented, those connections there. I think that poverty is another one. Right, especially when we think about, in an urban context, this process of urbanization. So we have First Nations young people coming to urban centers for things like school, because we don't have schools in reserve. That go to grade 12 a lot of times. So we have young people coming and that puts them at a greater risk. Also, things like not having water in your community, not having those basic needs puts you at a greater risk. Isolated communities, remote communities, lack of healthcare, all of those things are all risk factors for Indigenous people, and most of them are beyond the control of the person. Right. So especially when we work with youth, and this is why in Manitoba, like incarcerating 4 times more than any other province per capita is like mind blowing to me, because young people can't control where they live. and they can't control who their family is. They can't control if there's water. They can't control if there's a school. They can't control if there's a rec center, or if there's a hockey team that they can play on, or if they have the access to all of those things. So all of that is a risk factor, and it is so well documented to be connected to colonialism. All of those things kind of trickle down from that.
Yeah. Thanks so much. We're at the end of our time together, but Jen, you are a part of our Booth UC community, so people can follow up with you directly, I'm sure, if they have any other questions. I did want to quickly mention just a couple of additional events for this week. We do have a guest lecturer coming into Aaron Clausen's class tomorrow at 11:30. This is Dr. Owen Taves, who is a geographer and author of Stolen City, Racial Capitalism and the Making of Winnipeg. So very relevant to our local context here. And then Crystal is doing a beading tutorial that is not this week, Friday, but we've had to move it to next week, Friday, so March 18th. And if you could just contact Matt to sign up for that, Matt Peters. There's a nice photo of the project on the Populi dashboard if you want to see what the project is. And finally, but certainly not least, Jennifer is once again speaking to our Booth community this evening, tonight at 7 o'clock, as part of our Booth UC Toolkit Talks, where she is talking about our home and native land healing through stories. So some more really interesting conversation to have there. Jennifer, I just want to thank you so much. I appreciated you bringing the people's voice to your research, the insights to the justice system from so many different angles, and just some really clear, practical challenges to our community. Thank you so much. And for all of the rest of us who joined today, thank you for showing up. And just encourage you to go and to continue learning and motivate you into new partnerships and collaboration with Indigenous people moving forward. So thank you for coming, and we'll see you soon again.
Thank you. Thanks. If people want to reach out, I'm sure you can find me. I can't even tell you where, but you can find me. You can phone somebody.
Populi dashboard, just do a search.
Yes, I welcome further conversations. Thank you. Take care.